Jade Kingston settled into her plush first-class seat with a smile, adjusting her designer sunglasses as the plane began its final boarding. The luxury of the moment contrasted sharply with the tired, frustrated expressions of the passengers filing in behind her. Her leather jacket, perfectly tailored jeans, an expensive handbag screamed success, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in her hard-earned position. She'd fought every inch of the way to get here, this seat, this status. The flight attendant walked by, her eyes scanning the cabin as she moved efficiently between passengers. Then she stopped in front of Jade, a look of confusion momentarily flickering across her face. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant said, her tone polite but firm. "I'm afraid this seat is reserved." Jade blinked in disbelief. "Reserved?" she asked, glancing at her ticket. "It's my seat." The flight attendant's eyes flickered to the seat number, and back to Jade's face, and a subtle shift occurred in her demeanor. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake," she said. "I'll need to ask you to move." Jade's jaw tightened. She knew what was happening. This was no mistake. It was prejudice wrapped in a polite uniform. Her mind raced through the familiar frustrations of her journey, the assumptions, the underestimation, the need to constantly prove she belonged. This wasn't the first time she'd been subtly dismissed as out of place. She stood up slowly, her eyes locking with the flight attendants as the other passengers, oblivious to the tension, continued to settle in around them. "I assure you," Jade said with quiet confidence, "this is my seat." The flight attendant didn't respond, instead signaling for a colleague. Within moments, another attendant arrived, and the two exchanged whispers. The atmosphere shifted. Jade could feel the growing discomfort of the people nearby as the scene unfolded. Her discomfort wasn't from the confrontation itself but from the subtle, pervasive way she was being pushed aside. This wasn't just about a seat, it was about the persistent undercurrent of discrimination she'd encountered her whole life, where her worth was often questioned based solely on appearance. "Ma'am," the second flight attendant said, "I'll need to ask you to move to economy." Jade took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Economy? You're asking me to leave first class and go to economy?" "Yes, ma'am," the attendant replied. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." The other passengers had begun to notice, some whispering, others pulling out their phones. This was turning into a spectacle, and Jade wasn't going to let it define her. Instead, she stood up, offering a smile that felt more like a challenge than a concession. "Well, I suppose it's your plane," she said, her tone light but laced with irony. "Let's make the best of it." She turned to walk down the aisle toward the rear of the plane, fully aware of the eyes following her. When she reached the economy section, Jade paused. The contrast was stark: less legroom, fewer amenities, an entirely different world from the spacious luxury of first class. But instead of annoyance, a spark of something else ignited inside her: amusement. She could make this fun. As she slid into her seat, Jade scanned the cabin, her mind whirling with possibilities. She wasn't going to let this be the end of the story. No, she was going to take this ridiculous turn of events and turn it into something far more powerful. She had enough experience in the public eye to know how to spin a narrative. She knew how to turn perceived weakness into undeniable strength. With a sly grin, she pulled out her phone and began typing. Asterisk. Kicked out of first class for being too first class. Stay tuned. Asterisk. The tweet was sent out with a flourish. Jade sat back in her economy seat, arms crossed, a small but triumphant smile on her face. Within moments, the notification buzzed. Then another. And another. Her phone screen lit up with responses, some supportive, others mocking. But there was one thing she knew for sure: she had their attention. She chuckled to herself, knowing full well that she'd just become the subject of countless conversations in the coming hours. The seed had been planted. The absurdity of the situation was enough to spark curiosity, and she was more than willing to fan the flames. Her seatmates, a young mother with a toddler and an elderly couple, gave her curious glances. Jade smiled at them, the irony of her situation clear. Apparently, I'm not classy enough for first class, she said with a wink. The mother, exhausted from juggling her child, blinked in confusion but smiled back. They did that to you? She asked, gesturing toward the front of the plane. Jade nodded, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh yes, I'm just too much for their tastes. Too much class, you know? The elderly couple laughed softly, clearly entertained by her unexpected humor. Well, we're happy to have you back here with us, the older woman said kindly. Jade sat back in her seat, eyeing the unfolding scene. She had to admit, the whole situation was absurd. But instead of letting it frustrate her, she decided to make a game of it. The flight attendant passed by, eyeing her warily. Jade flashed a bright, exaggerated smile. Best seat in the house, she quipped. Although, I do miss my champagne. As she looked around the cabin, she realized how little space there was for people in economy. The aisles were narrow, the overhead bins were cramped, and the seats were uncomfortable. It was an entirely different experience, one that Jade wasn't used to, but it didn't bother her in the least. Instead, she found herself focusing on the other passengers. Many of them seemed just as uncomfortable in their own way. There was the nervous teenager sitting across from her, clutching his backpack as though it might hold the answers to life's mysteries. And then the couple, their quiet murmurs offering a stark contrast to the bustling energy of first class. Jade smiled inwardly. She was going to make this experience something unforgettable. She pulled out her phone again and began typing another tweet. Asterisk. Turns out, economy has better stories than champagne. Asterisk. Before she hit send, she paused for a moment. There was something here, a message, a point to be made. She wasn't just another billionaire sitting in first class, showing off her wealth and privilege. No, she was something more. She was a catalyst. She tapped the screen and sent the tweet. Jade's phone buzzed almost instantly. The notifications were pouring in faster than she could keep up. She watched with a wry smile as her tweet began to go viral. There were likes, retweets, and comments flooding in from all corners of the internet. The reactions were mixed. Some found the situation hilarious, others not so much. But it didn't matter. The point had been made. She had their attention. She glanced at her seatmates. The mother was trying to calm her fussy child, the toddler's cries filling the otherwise quiet cabin. Jade couldn't help but feel for her. Parenthood was hard, especially in a confined space like this. Hey, Jade said, her voice light. Need a hand? The woman looked at her in surprise, then shook her head with a smile. I'm good, thank you. Jade nodded, giving her a reassuring look before turning back to her phone. The toddler's cries were relentless, but Jade didn't want to intrude. Instead, she focused on her phone, watching as her posts spread like wildfire across social media. She couldn't help but feel a sense of power. This wasn't just about being in economy. It wasn't about getting kicked out of first class. This was about something bigger, challenging the status quo, questioning the class divide, and showing people that the world didn't revolve around luxury and privilege. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a direct message from her assistant, Greg. Asterisk. Jade, the story is blowing up. People are calling it #economy revolution. The press is reaching out. They want an interview. Asterisk. Jade smirked. #economy revolution. Of course, that's what they were calling it. She had a knack for turning the absurd into a movement. She typed a quick reply. Asterisk. Tell them I'm busy for the next few hours. This is my time to observe. Asterisk. The tweet notifications continued to flood in. People were reacting not just to her situation but to the larger issues she had unintentionally uncovered. The divide between the haves and the have-nots was more apparent than ever, and Jade was smack in the middle of it. She leaned back in her seat and began to scroll through the comments. Some were mocking her, calling her entitled, or suggesting that she was just throwing a tantrum over a seat. But more were rallying behind her, pointing out the absurdity of the class system in airlines. People were talking about their own experiences, how they'd been treated unfairly, overlooked, or outright disrespected because of their appearance, their income, or their race. One tweet caught her eye. It was from a woman who'd written, asterisk, "I've been there. Kicked out of first class because I didn't look the part. What happened to us?" Asterisk. Jade's heart skipped. She wasn't alone in this. The realization hit her hard. This wasn't just her battle. It was a battle that countless others had fought, silently and often without recognition. But now, they were being heard. A soft chuckle escaped her lips. "This is just the beginning," she murmured to herself. She couldn't resist taking a few more photos, one of the cramped economy section, the other of her seatmates. They were all strangers, but there was a shared solidarity in the way they were forced together in this small corner of the plane. Jade snapped another picture, this time of the empty first-class seats up front. She captioned it, asterisk, "First class last laugh." Asterisk. The tweets kept coming, and so did the support. There was an overwhelming response from both influencers and everyday people who had experienced the same kind of discrimination. The more Jade read, the more she realized how systemic the problem was. It wasn't just a matter of class, it was about race, gender, and identity. How many times had she herself been questioned, judged, or even mocked for simply existing in spaces that others didn't think she belonged? She thought back to the countless meetings, dinners, and events where she'd had to fight to be taken seriously, where people treated her like an accessory or a curiosity because of her appearance. It was a feeling she'd become all too familiar with, and now, here she was, turning that experience into a rallying cry. She glanced up from her phone to see the flight attendant walking down the aisle again. Jade's eyes narrowed. She was sure the staff had been told to keep an eye on her, but she wasn't concerned. She wasn't breaking any rules. She wasn't causing trouble. She was just existing. And in doing so, she was making a statement. The attendant made eye contact, and Jade couldn't resist a smirk. She leaned back in her seat, raising an eyebrow in silent challenge. The attendant hesitated for a moment before continuing on her way. Jade watched her retreat, amused by the unease she seemed to carry. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Greg. Asterisk. "The airline has issued a statement. They're trying to downplay the incident and say it was a misunderstanding. But it's clear the backlash is real." Asterisk. Jade smiled. Asterisk. "Good. Let them try to spin it. It won't work." Asterisk. She sat back and took in the situation. The entire flight had become a microcosm of the class struggle. The first-class passengers were oblivious to the real drama unfolding in the back. They continued to sip their champagne, enjoy their spacious legroom, and act as though the world outside their little bubble didn't exist. But Jade knew better. She wasn't just fighting for her seat. She was fighting for everyone who had been forced to sit in the back, pushed aside, ignored. She was fighting for the people who had been told, in so many subtle and overt ways, that they didn't matter. Another tweet came in. Asterisk. "Why is it that the richest people are often the most invisible? Jade Kingston is showing us why we need to rethink how we treat each other." Asterisk. Jade smiled. Her words were reaching more people than she'd ever expected. She wasn't just an individual protesting a small inconvenience. She was a symbol of something larger, a beacon for change, a voice for the voiceless. And the best part? She was just getting started. The plane had been airborne for what seemed like an eternity, but Jade was no longer focused on the time or the flight itself. Her mind was racing with the possibilities unfolding before her. The social media buzz continued to grow, and she could see the influence she was starting to wield. She wasn't just a billionaire being unjustly removed from first class. She was a catalyst for a much larger conversation about classism, discrimination, and the way people were treated based on appearances. Her phone screen buzzed again, another message from Greg. Asterisk. "The hashtags are trending everywhere. This is huge, Jade. I've heard from several prominent activists, and they want to get involved. The media's reaching out nonstop. What's the next move?" Asterisk. Jade paused before responding. She wasn't just going to let this moment pass. She knew how to leverage a moment like this, turn it into something far more impactful than just a viral tweet. She'd been in the business world long enough to understand the power of public perception. This was an opportunity to make a real difference. She typed out a quick reply. Asterisk. Let's make this a movement. Call the press, get the activists on board. We're doing this right. Asterisk. Her phone buzzed again almost immediately. A journalist from a well-known outlet had reached out, asking for a comment. She stared at the message, carefully considering her response. She wasn't going to let the media twist this into a sensationalized story about a wealthy woman throwing a tantrum. This was about systemic issues. This was about the normalization of discrimination. And she was going to make that clear. Jade took a deep breath and began typing. Asterisk. I'm not throwing a fit because I didn't get my champagne. I'm calling attention to how this class divide continues to affect people, not just on planes but in every area of life. It's about the prejudice we continue to accept as normal. This is bigger than me. It's bigger than an airline seat. Asterisk. She hit send. Within minutes, the response was picked up by several outlets. Jade could already feel the momentum building. People were starting to pay attention not just to the incident but to the underlying message. She looked around the cabin again. The mother was still trying to comfort her child, and the elderly couple was reading quietly. In this moment, it felt almost surreal. She was the only one aware of the growing conversation unfolding outside the plane. The rest of the passengers were still caught in their own worlds. Her phone buzzed again. Asterisk. I've been following the conversation. I'm in. Let's bring this to the public. Asterisk. It was a direct message from one of the prominent activists she'd known from her charity work. Jade smiled. This was exactly what she needed, the right people, the right voices, to help amplify the message. The flight attendants passed by again, but this time, they avoided looking at her. Jade had made her point, and she knew it. They'd been told to keep quiet, to let the situation settle, but the truth had already started to take root. Jade was done being ignored. She had been ignored her entire life. By people who thought they knew her, by systems that worked to push her out, and by society that refused to see beyond the surface. But now, she was the one holding the power. The phone buzzed once more, this time with an alert from a popular influencer. Asterisk. What happened to Jade Kingston is a perfect example of why we need to challenge the status quo. We need to talk about the bigger issue, how this divide is perpetuated everywhere. #economy revolution. Asterisk. Jade's heart skipped. The conversation was spreading beyond just a moment of injustice. It was turning into a real dialogue about privilege and power. People weren't just laughing at her predicament, they were questioning the systems that created it. They were calling out airlines, questioning why the wealthiest passengers were given preferential treatment. Why did a seat matter so much? Why did the class of a person define how they were treated? She felt a pang of something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. She could make a difference. She could spark something bigger than herself. The plane continued its journey, but Jade's mind was already on what would come next. She knew this wasn't just going to be another viral moment that faded into the background. This was a movement, and it was going to force a shift. Jade checked her watch. They were nearing their destination. The rest of the flight had passed in a blur of social media responses and interviews. She had already started making plans for the press conference she'd give once the plane landed. She never imagined that a simple mistake by the airline would lead to something this significant, but she was determined to make the most of it. As they began their descent, Jade couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. She wasn't the one who had been wrong, she was the one who had sparked change. She wasn't just a wealthy passenger fighting for her rights. She was a voice for those who had been silenced, for those who hadn't had the platform to speak out. She smiled to herself. There was more work to do, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her phone buzzed one final time as the plane touched down. It was a message from Greg. Asterisk. The airline has just issued a public apology. They're meeting with us tomorrow. We've got the momentum. You're a game changer. Asterisk. Jade sat back in her seat, a sense of satisfaction washing over her. This was just the beginning. The moment the plane touched down, Jade's phone buzzed again. It wasn't a single message but a flurry of notifications. Social media was in overdrive. She could see the viral nature of what had begun to unfold, but now it was no longer just about her situation. It was about the larger issue, the hypocrisy of the class system, the systemic exclusion, and the blatant disregard for basic human dignity in the name of luxury. She quickly opened her messages, reading through the storm of tweets, news articles, and press calls. The airline's public apology had already been issued, but it felt half-hearted. They were trying to downplay the incident as a misunderstanding, yet the backlash was relentless. They had underestimated the power of a single tweet and the force of the collective voice. Jade had a choice to make. She could let the moment fizzle out, settle for the apology, and let the story become yesterday's news. Or she could turn this into a full-scale revolution, push for change, and challenge the very infrastructure that allowed this kind of inequality to thrive. The more she thought about it, the clearer her decision became. She wasn't going to let them off the hook. Not this time. Her phone rang. It was Greg. Jade, the airline is pulling out all the stops. They want to meet with us. They want to discuss a resolution. His tone was cautious but hopeful. She paused. What kind of resolution? They're offering compensation, a public acknowledgement of their mistake, and they want to know if you'll help them address the public perception. Jade laughed, but it wasn't a joyous sound. I don't think I'm the one they need help from. They're the ones who need to fix the system, not me. Greg sighed. I know, but they'll do anything to avoid this turning into a full-on crisis. They're scared. People are calling for boycotts, and the media is picking up on this every hour. She thought about it for a moment. This was the turning point. The airline had no idea what they were about to unleash. They were underestimating the power of social media and the anger simmering beneath the surface. The more she read the tweets, the more she saw a pattern. People weren't just angry, they were emboldened. They were ready for change. Set the meeting up, Jade said decisively. But don't let them think this is over after a handshake and a check. They'll have to answer for a lot more than just a seat. Greg's voice perked up. You got it. I'll let them know. Jade hung up and leaned back in her seat. The plane was emptying out now, but the mission was just beginning. The idea that something as trivial as an airline seat could spark a revolution wasn't lost on her. It was a testament to the small ways in which society's inequities were embedded in everyday life. People didn't just fight for first class, they fought for a seat at the table, for the ability to be seen, heard, and valued. The truth was, she hadn't expected this. When she tweeted about being kicked out of first class, she thought it would be a brief moment of frustration shared by a few people. But it had evolved into something bigger, and the stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about an individual's comfort. This was about fighting against a system that perpetuated inequality under the guise of luxury. Her phone buzzed again. It was a reminder from Greg, asterisk. The press conference is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Prepare for a media storm. Asterisk. Tomorrow. It felt like a lifetime away. But she knew what needed to be done. Jade wasn't the kind of person to just sit back and watch things unfold. She had spent years building her empire, overcoming obstacles, and fighting for her place in a world that tried to push her out. This was no different. She stood up from her seat and grabbed her bag, ready to leave the plane. She walked through the terminal, her mind already moving ahead, planning the next steps. There would be interviews, meetings, and press conferences to manage, but beyond that, she knew that the movement was just beginning. The pressure to address the underlying issues of classism, prejudice, and systemic inequality was going to come from all angles. The media would be relentless. But Jade wasn't intimidated. She had faced far worse. As she stepped into the waiting car, she looked out the window at the hustle and bustle of the city. People were moving about their business, unaware of the seismic shift that was beginning to take place. "Take me to the office," she said to the driver. The office was where the real work would begin. She had already drafted a speech, but it was more than just words. It was a call to action. It wasn't just about exposing the airline. It was about creating a cultural shift that would force corporations to rethink how they operated. Jade knew that to make real change, she had to hold the powerful accountable. It wasn't going to be easy. But she was no stranger to tough battles. The car pulled up to the building, and Jade stepped out, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She was ready. The world had taken notice. Now, it was time to deliver. Inside the office, she immediately went to work. She had a team waiting for her, eager to help with the next phase of the movement. "We're starting with a press conference," Jade said, her voice steady. "But it doesn't stop there. We're going to take this conversation to every corner of the country." Her assistant Greg handed her a folder. Inside were the first drafts of the talking points for the press conference. Jade skimmed through the pages, then tossed them aside. "This is too soft. We need to make an impact." Greg looked at her, then nodded, understanding what she meant. "Right. You want to hit hard." Jade's eyes gleamed with purpose. "I want to force them to listen. We need to take this beyond just a statement. This is about changing the way people see themselves, about making them realize that they have a voice and a choice in how they're treated." She sat at the table and began to write. This wasn't just about one company or one mistake. It was about breaking down a system that had benefited the few at the expense of the many. She wasn't going to let them bury the conversation under corporate jargon or media spin. This was the moment when everything could change. And Jade Kingston wasn't going to let it slip away. The press conference was set, and Jade had no time to waste. She was already in the conference room, pacing back and forth. The world was watching. The eyes of millions, including the very media who had once considered her just another wealthy businesswoman, were now focused on her every word. She wasn't going to waste this opportunity. This was bigger than the viral tweet, bigger than the airline apology. This was her chance to spark something much more significant, a shift in the way society viewed power, privilege, and equality. Her phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. It was Greg. "The airline's PR team is here. They're nervous. They want to talk about strategy, but I think they know they're in trouble." Jade couldn't help but smile. She had worked in high-stakes negotiations before, but nothing like this. She was no longer just a player in the business world. She was now the symbol of change, and the people behind the airline were scrambling to regain control. "Good," Jade replied. "Let them sweat. This isn't just about a seat anymore, it's about accountability." She ended the conversation and walked to the podium, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. As she stood in front of the microphone, the room fell silent. The journalists, their cameras ready, watched her closely. She looked at them with a steady gaze, feeling the weight of the moment. She began speaking, her voice clear and unwavering. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Jade Kingston. You all know me as a billionaire, an entrepreneur, someone who's made a name for herself in the corporate world. But today, I'm here as something much more important, a voice for the millions of people who experience the prejudice and exclusion that continues to pervade our society." There was a pause. She could see the journalists shifting, trying to absorb the gravity of her words. She had their attention, but she needed more. She wasn't here for a simple soundbite. She was here to shift the conversation. "I was removed from my first-class seat by an airline that claims to offer luxury experiences. But the truth is, that seat had nothing to do with luxury. It was about class. It was about the idea that because I don't look like the people they expect in their so-called premium cabins, I'm not worthy of the same treatment. And I'm here to tell you that it's time to end that narrative." She paused again, letting the weight of her words sink in. The room was still. She could almost hear the collective intake of breath from the journalists. This wasn't what they had expected. They had expected her to apologize for making a scene, to accept the company's apology, and move on. Instead, she was holding them accountable in front of the world. "We are all human beings," Jade continued. "We are all worthy of dignity and respect, regardless of our race, our background, or our financial status. What happened to me is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger issue, one that extends far beyond an airplane cabin. It's about the way we normalize discrimination in every part of our lives. From the boardroom to the classroom to the airport, these systems are designed to keep people like me, and so many others, on the outside." She could see the first stirrings of movement in the room. The reporters were leaning forward, their pens flying as they scribbled down her words. Jade knew they were listening now, but she had more to say. "I don't want your apologies. What I want is action. I want every company, every institution, to start asking themselves, how are we treating people? How are we creating systems that either lift people up or push them down based on their status? And most importantly, I want everyone to start recognizing that privilege isn't just about wealth. It's about opportunity, it's about access, it's about fairness. And it's time we made it equitable for everyone." Jade took a deep breath and let the silence stretch out. She was giving them a moment to process what she had just said. This was a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone who had been sidelined by systems designed to favor the few over the many. "I've had enough of being the exception. I'm not just a wealthy woman fighting for my rights. I'm standing here as a representative of every single person who has ever been marginalized, overlooked, or pushed aside. And I'm here to say that it's time for change." There was a shift in the room. The journalists were no longer just taking notes. They were engaged. They were asking questions, probing for more details. But Jade wasn't here to offer them simple answers. She was here to challenge them, to make them think critically about the world they inhabited and the systems they perpetuated. She knew she had made her point. The movement wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been told they didn't belong. It was about disrupting the status quo. She could already hear the conversations happening outside the room. People were talking, tweeting, sharing their thoughts. The conversation had spread beyond the walls of this conference room. The seeds of a cultural shift were already being planted. Jade knew this was just the beginning. The airline would make their adjustments, but it wasn't going to stop with them. She wasn't going to stop until there was real change, until corporations and institutions understood that diversity and inclusion weren't just buzzwords. They were imperatives. As the press conference came to a close, Jade walked out of the room with her head held high. There was no going back. She had set the stage for something far bigger than a viral moment, or a single apology. She had sparked a conversation that was long overdue, one that had the potential to transform the way society saw power, privilege, and the worth of every individual. Jade Kingston wasn't just a businesswoman anymore. She was a leader, an advocate for change, and a beacon of resilience for those who had been left behind. And this was only the beginning. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind. Jade's phone didn't stop buzzing, and her inbox was flooded with requests for interviews, partnerships, and offers from advocacy groups. The story had exploded. What began as a single tweet about being unjustly bumped from a first-class seat had turned into a full-scale movement, forcing everyone to take a hard look at the systems of privilege embedded in society. Jade wasn't just the face of a viral sensation anymore. She had become the spearhead of a new wave of activism. The media had picked up on her message, but they were also scrutinizing her every move. She was aware of the pressure that was mounting. The airline had issued another statement, claiming they were making improvements, but Jade wasn't satisfied with just words. She was determined to hold them accountable for their actions. Actions spoke louder than apologies, and she wasn't about to let them off the hook so easily. Greg called early the next morning. His voice was urgent. "Jade, I just spoke to the airline's executives. They're making more concessions, but they're trying to shift the narrative. They're focusing on customer service and how inclusive they're becoming. They want you to endorse their new program." Jade's lips curled into a tight smile. "Endorse? They don't get to use me as their PR shield. Let them fix the problem at its core. They're not doing me, or anyone else, a favor by slapping a new label on their policies. This is bigger than a PR campaign. Greg hesitated before replying. I agree. But you need to make sure that the public sees your stance clearly. The last thing you want is for this to fizzle out. I'm not going to let it fizzle out, Jade said, her voice resolute. But this isn't about one airline's mistake, it's about the deeper systemic issues that need to be addressed. She hung up the phone, her mind already racing with ideas. She was clear on one thing: she wasn't just going to be a part of the conversation. She was going to drive it. She had a platform now, a stage that people were watching, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. Jade set up a meeting with some of the most prominent activists and thought leaders in diversity and inclusion. She wanted their input. She wasn't looking for a simple fix, she wanted a lasting solution. They needed to start with the airlines, but this had to extend far beyond that. It had to challenge every institution, every business, and every individual to reflect on their role in perpetuating inequality. As she met with these experts, she began to understand the complexity of the task ahead. It wasn't just about changing policies or launching campaigns. It was about dismantling an entire mindset, one that had been ingrained for generations. The idea that luxury and comfort were reserved only for those who could afford it, and that those in the lower classes were undeserving, was woven into the fabric of society. It was a mindset that permeated everything, from corporate boardrooms to government policies to the way people interacted in everyday life. Jade knew that the battle wasn't going to be easy. But she was no stranger to hard work. She had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, facing challenges, and breaking down barriers that were designed to keep her from succeeding. This was no different. The journey ahead was going to take grit, perseverance, and the ability to stay focused on the larger goal, no matter how many distractions or obstacles arose. She called a press conference for the following week, but this time, it wasn't about her. This time, it was about the people who had been affected by these systems, those who had been excluded or pushed aside because of the way they looked, where they came from, or how much money they had. Jade had started a movement, but now it was time to make it more than just a conversation. It had to be a call to action. She stood before the cameras once again, but her tone was different this time. This wasn't about highlighting one issue. It was about empowering others to take control of their own narratives. This is about more than just getting a seat on an airplane, she said, her voice steady and firm. This is about creating a world where everyone, regardless of their race, their income, or their background, has an equal chance at dignity and respect. It's about the right to be seen as equal in every situation, whether it's in the workplace, the classroom, or yes, even on an airplane. Jade took a deep breath, her words coming with the weight of everything she had been fighting for. We cannot continue to pretend that these inequalities are not a part of our daily lives. We cannot ignore the ways in which our systems continue to exclude and oppress people who don't fit a certain mold. If we want to create true equality, we need to start by changing the way we view privilege. And that means acknowledging that some of us have advantages that others don't. And we need to use those advantages to lift up those who have been left behind. Her words were met with applause. The response from the audience was electric. Jade had struck a chord, but now came the harder part, ensuring that the momentum didn't die. She needed to rally people to her cause, to help them see that this wasn't just her fight. It was everyone's fight. Later that evening, she was interviewed by a prominent news anchor who asked her about her plans for the future. Jade's answer was clear. This movement is about more than just words. It's about concrete steps toward change. We're working with advocacy groups to push for stronger policies on diversity and inclusion in corporate America. But we're also creating programs to help people understand the power they hold. This isn't just about me standing at the podium. It's about all of us standing together and demanding accountability. Jade's message was resonating across the country. People were sharing their stories, their frustrations, and their hopes for change. It was clear that the issue of classism and inequality had touched a nerve. People were tired of being overlooked, of being treated like they didn't matter simply because of who they were. Jade was just one person, but she wasn't standing alone anymore. The movement had gained momentum, and now it was about turning that momentum into real, lasting change. The airline had been the catalyst, but the work was far from over. It was only just beginning. Jade had never imagined the depth of the response her words would provoke. It wasn't just the immediate media frenzy or the viral social media posts. It was the quiet conversations happening in boardrooms, community centers, and family kitchens. People from all walks of life were sharing their experiences of inequality, discrimination, and exclusion. And as the stories flooded in, Jade realized something powerful. The movement wasn't just about holding the airline accountable. It was about waking up the collective consciousness of society. The momentum was undeniable, but so were the challenges. Not everyone was on board with the idea of change. Resistance came in many forms. Some questioned her motives. Others dismissed her message as a stunt. A few even criticized her for distracting from more important issues. But Jade wasn't deterred. She knew that lasting change was never easy, and that those who pushed for it often faced the harshest opposition. Greg was worried too. "Jade, the backlash is growing. The critics are getting louder. The airline's competitors are using this as an opportunity to distance themselves from the controversy. Some are calling it a false narrative. They're trying to paint you as someone who's using this moment for personal gain." Jade wasn't surprised by the opposition. She had expected it. "Let them talk," she said, her voice calm. "They can't stop the truth. The system is broken, and it's time for us to fix it. We're not doing this for applause, we're doing it for justice." Her words carried weight, but Jade knew that just talking about the problem wasn't enough. Action was what mattered. She had been in the business world long enough to know that a well-crafted message could only go so far. Real transformation came from within institutions, from policy changes, and from holding the powerful accountable. She wasn't about to let her movement become a hashtag that faded into obscurity. Her next move was crucial. She needed to force the airline to take real, concrete steps toward change. It wasn't enough for them to issue a statement and move on. Jade's team began working with legal experts, diversity consultants, and activists to craft a series of demands that would challenge the status quo in the airline industry. These demands weren't just about accessibility. They were about shifting the entire culture of how the airline industry viewed its customers. "Jade, this is huge," Greg said one morning. "You're asking for things no one has ever dared to ask. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" Jade took a moment before responding. She had spent her life in the trenches, fighting for a seat at the table. This wasn't about being liked. It was about creating the change she wanted to see. "I'm sure. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about every person who has been excluded, marginalized, or made to feel less than. We're starting with the airline, but this will reach every industry. If we can force them to change, we can show the world that this isn't just a luxury for the few. It's a basic human right." The demands were comprehensive. They called for transparent pricing, inclusive hiring practices, and better treatment of all passengers, regardless of their economic background. It was more than just a list of requests, it was a blueprint for what an inclusive and equitable future could look like. And Jade wasn't going to let them off easy. The airline had a choice: either take these demands seriously, or risk becoming the face of the most public example of corporate failure in history. As Jade prepared to present the demands publicly, the media continued to churn out stories about her movement. Some painted her as a hero, others as a troublemaker. But Jade knew that the true test would come when the airline executives were forced to make a decision. They could no longer afford to treat this as a passing issue. The world was watching. The airline responded, as expected, with a mix of deflection and half-hearted promises. They insisted they were committed to listening to their customers and pledged to work on diversity and inclusion. But Jade wasn't fooled by their PR spin. She knew that true progress didn't come from vague statements, it came from tangible results. She made her next move swiftly. "We need to get the media on our side, but not just for the story. They need to help us hold them accountable," Jade told Greg as she prepared for the next round of interviews. She knew that exposing the airline's lack of real action was crucial. She wasn't going to let them play the waiting game. This wasn't about waiting for change, it was about demanding it, in real time. The backlash from the airline grew louder. They tried to discredit her, calling her a disruptor and a radical. But the more they tried to silence her, the louder her message became. Jade's platform was growing, and with it, a community of advocates, allies, and activists who rallied behind her cause. The narrative was shifting from one of a privileged billionaire to that of a leader who was standing up for the people who had long been overlooked. Her next press conference was pivotal. Jade stood before a room full of reporters, cameras flashing, and microphones thrust in her direction. This time, she wasn't just talking about policies or statistics. She was speaking directly to the people who had supported her from the beginning. "I'm here today to announce that we're not backing down," she said, her voice strong. "The airline has had months to act, and all we've seen are empty promises and vague gestures. It's time to hold them accountable. We're demanding immediate changes, changes that will ensure every person who steps onto an airplane is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." Jade paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "But this isn't just about an airline. This is about every system that's designed to keep people from having equal access to opportunity. If we can change this, we can change everything. We can create a world where no one is judged by the color of their skin, the size of their bank account, or the job they hold." The room was silent. The journalists were no longer just asking questions, they were listening. The movement had taken on a life of its own, and Jade had become the face of something much larger than herself. She was fighting for a world where everyone, regardless of their background, could sit at the table and have a voice. Jade knew the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. But she also knew one thing for certain: this was her fight. And she wasn't going to let anyone silence her, or the millions of people who were standing with her. The change they sought wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Jade's call to action had ignited a firestorm of support, but it also sparked a reckoning. The airline, under increasing pressure, now had no choice but to address her demands. They tried to negotiate, offering vague commitments to improve their policies, but Jade wasn't having it. This was no longer about simply changing a few rules. It was about dismantling a broken system that treated people based on their class, race, and perceived worth. The public was watching, and Jade was prepared to hold them accountable. Her legal team had spent countless hours drafting detailed proposals that would force the airline to completely overhaul their practices. The demands were specific and actionable, covering everything from seating policies to employee training, and from transparency in ticket pricing to the representation of marginalized groups in corporate leadership. Jade wasn't asking for favors, she was demanding fairness. The time for vague promises was over. The airline responded with its own legal team, a barrage of corporate rhetoric designed to confuse and delay. But Jade was undeterred. She had spent her career in corporate America, navigating the complexities of business and power. She knew the tricks, the games, and the manipulation tactics used by large corporations to maintain the status quo. This wasn't the first time she had faced an uphill battle, and it wouldn't be the last. Greg, now fully on board with the movement, stood by her side, supporting every step of the way. "We're ready for this," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the task ahead. "We have the momentum, and the people are behind us. Let's make sure they understand we're not backing down." Jade nodded. "This isn't just about us, Greg. It's about all the people who've been quietly suffering under systems that weren't designed for them. We're the voice for those who've been silenced for too long." But as much as Jade and her team were determined to fight, they knew they couldn't win this alone. They needed allies, and they needed the public's continued support. The social media campaign that had started as a joke had now transformed into a full-fledged movement. Hashtags like #EqualityInFlight and #AirlineJustice had gone viral, and their influence was undeniable. Celebrities, activists, and even politicians had begun to speak out, demanding that airlines change their policies. But Jade knew it was still going to take a hard, strategic push to make this change stick. The turning point came when a major news outlet covered the story in depth, bringing to light the systemic inequalities not just in the airline industry, but in the broader social framework. The piece went viral, circulating through news channels, blogs, and social media platforms. This coverage wasn't just about Jade's personal experience. It was about the lives of millions who had been treated as less than, dismissed because of the color of their skin, their socioeconomic status, or their perceived lack of importance. The article linked her fight to a larger cultural shift, showing that this wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a global movement to end inequality. Jade's demand for change was not without its consequences. Some of the airline's top executives began to attack her directly, calling her a radical and a troublemaker who was trying to destroy a multi-billion-dollar industry. Their words stung, but Jade refused to be distracted. She was in the fight for the long haul, and this was just the beginning. She had to keep her focus on the bigger picture. It wasn't just about her personal story. It was about a society that needed to wake up to the injustices happening in every corner of the globe. In the midst of the chaos, Jade had an epiphany. It wasn't enough to make the airline change. The real challenge was changing the culture that allowed such discrimination to persist. Jade had experienced firsthand how classism and racism infiltrated every facet of society. She had seen the way those with wealth and power used their privilege to maintain the system. And now, as she stood at the forefront of this movement, she realized that what she was fighting for wasn't just about access to first-class seats. It was about reshaping how people thought about privilege, power, and equality. Her realization propelled her into action. She expanded her efforts to include partnerships with advocacy groups, diversity organizations, and even labor unions. She knew that for real change to occur, it had to be a collective effort. The airline was just one example, one manifestation of the broader issue. And if she could help push this cultural shift on such a large scale, she could lay the foundation for a world where everyone, regardless of their background, had equal access to opportunity. Jade began speaking at conferences and forums, using her platform to advocate for more than just her specific case. She spoke about the larger issues of inequality in society, the ways in which systems of power kept people divided and oppressed. She didn't just want to be the face of a movement, she wanted to be the catalyst for a global awakening. As Jade's influence grew, so did her responsibilities. She became a mentor to young activists, guiding them through the complexities of social justice work. She spoke to them about resilience, about the importance of keeping the faith even when things seemed impossible. She encouraged them to never back down, no matter the odds. "We have to be the change we want to see," Jade told a group of rising stars in the activist world. "We can't just talk about justice and equality, we have to live it. We have to fight for it every single day." Her words resonated deeply. The young activists, inspired by her leadership, began to take action in their own communities. They organized protests, started petitions, and engaged in conversations that challenged the status quo. Jade was proud of them, but she also knew that the journey wasn't over. This fight would take years, if not decades, to fully win. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings and strategizing, Jade sat down with Greg and reflected on how far they had come. The airline had finally begun to make concessions, agreeing to some of her demands, though not all. She was grateful for the progress, but she knew there was still much work to be done. "We've changed things, but we're not done yet," Jade said, her tone resolute. "This is just the beginning. The world is watching, and we can't stop now." Greg smiled. "You're right. We've started a revolution, and there's no turning back." Jade nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. She had fought for what was right, and she had sparked a movement that was bigger than herself. She knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew that with every step they took, they were creating a world where equality, justice, and dignity for all were no longer a dream, but a reality.